What's going on, everybody? Welcome to my first official Arms Warrior guide for the new expansion Shadowlands. That is the Arms Warrior guide for PvP. Now, like all of my guides in the past, I'll be going over our general talents. I'll then go into our PvP talents. I'll go into Covenant selection, conduits, legendaries, stat selection, and then I'll also spend some time giving you some general tips and tricks on the class, some of the mistakes I made along the way, and I think by the end of this guide, you'll have a better idea on how to play the class successfully. Now, before we hop into this guide, a quick thank you and message from our sponsor of this video. Thank you, Arcade Unchained, for sponsoring this video. Arcade Unchained is a non-subscription based sandbox style MMO that has a strong focus on PvP, and with over 220 interchangeable classes through their own unique skill sets, players can discover and swap builds to fit their own playstyle, all while using a single character. You can sail the vast and uncharted oceans or conquer the skies with aerial combat, amass fame and fortune by securing trade routes, and becoming a gatherer, crafter, or trader in effort to build your own houses, ships, and castles. The game is continuously being updated and has recently undergone a major graphical overhaul, and also introduces the new Swiftblade Assassin as a starter class. Perhaps my favorite feature about the game is there's no pay-to-win model, providing an equal playing field to all players. Players progress through the free track of the Arc Pass to obtain player power necessary to progress in the game, while the premium track only offers additional cosmetic. Again, the game has no pay-to-win features and is free to download till January 19th, so go explore the world for yourself. Check the link in the description for more information, and thank you, Arcade, for sponsoring this video. All right, now hopping back into the guide. I actually wanted to do this guide with Magnus, but I've been so busy. Now, Magnus is the reason I've learned so much about the class in the past couple months. Warrior, like many of you know, is a new class for me. I typically play a lot of different classes on this channel to make guides like this, and I was able to get Gladiator the first week, so I thought it'd be a good time to make the guide, but because I'm so busy, I wasn't able to bring him in. But I will have his written guide if you're looking for some more information linked in the description box below, as well as his stream. So if you're looking for any additional tips that I do not discuss in this video, go ahead and head over there, or you can also check out my stream as well, and some other warriors I will also have linked in the description box below. So with that being said, we're gonna hop into our general talents first. So as far as these talents go, I'm gonna go over them rather quickly. I'm gonna tell you the ones that you just always take. I'm not gonna spend too much time on the things that you don't take. Level 15, you're always taking sudden death. Level 25, you're always taking Stormbolt, unless you're playing some weird comp where you don't need an extra stun, but most likely you'll be playing a comp where you do need a stun, so you will be playing Stormbolt. Level 30, this is the big question for a lot of people. When do you take Rend? When do you take Massacre? Currently in Shadowlands 9.0, the first season, the first couple weeks of the expansion, the game is just so fast-paced right now, and your stats aren't going to be where you want them to be. With the current levels of haste that you do have, playing Rend just doesn't feel very optimal. It is a PvE talent that you take almost always, but for PvP, you're not able to get a lot of use out of Rend. There are some cases where you can take it when you're trying to, maybe you're fighting into like a TSG Frost DK Warrior, for example, and you don't want to be in the fight too long because you don't want to get, struggle with Heartstop or in Delirium. In those cases, you might take Rend, but generally because people are spiking so low so often because it's so bursty, you find much more use out of Massacre. As stats go up towards maybe the middle of the expansion, you will find use for Rend, but currently Massacre is just the go-to. For level 35, you need D-Stance. That's why Arms Warrior is infinitely better than Fury. Just having D-Stance is a major defensive. For level 40, Warbreaker all the way. You never take Cleave. You never take collateral damage. Level 45, once again, Avatar has way too many use cases for increased damage and breaking your roots, so it's an all-around very solid talent. Now for level 50, Dreadnought over Anger Management. Again, the games are so fast that Dreadnought is going to give you much more value than Anger Management. However, if you are playing the Condemn Warrior and you're dumping a lot of rage into Condemn, I've seen some warriors opt to play Anger Management, and it does have use cases there because you're able to get your Bladestorm and Warbreaker out much more often because you are spending so much rage. But again, I think Dreadnought offers damage for just single target cleave, and since the games are so short, you don't really get the use out of a second Warbreaker or Bladestorm. Okay, now hopping into the PvP talents, this is where it gets a little bit tricky, and I'm going to try to give you some bread and butter setups, some cookie cutter setups to kind of give you a better idea of what you should be taking. Really quickly, I'm going to talk about the talents that you never never take. You really never take Demolition, and you never take Shadow of the Colossus. So getting those out of the way, the rest of these do have some use cases. The other one that you rarely will ever take is Death Sentence. This is something that you would see with like Condemn Warriors, but since I'm a Curian Warrior, and we'll hop into that a little bit later on in the video, it can have use cases then, maybe even for 2s, but in 3s, you can't really afford to take this talent very often. So those 3 are ones that you won't often talent into. But Sharpened Blade, for example, is one that you would take almost every game unless you cannot afford to drop some utility talents. So when you're fighting melee cleaves, this is very effective. When you're fighting any like hybrid comp with like a caster and a melee, outside of like setup based comps, you might take Sharpened Blade, like Shadow Priest, Warrior, for example. Sharpened Blade will have great use case there. But in Rogue Mage or Jungle, you can't really afford to take this talent, but this is a talent that you want to try to lock in as often as you can. So based on if you take Sharpened Blade or not will determine the kind of build that you're playing. So when you're looking at playing into like a melee cleave or popular 2s talents into other melee classes that you can disarm, so like maybe another warrior, these are talents that you'll often play. So if I'm playing into turbo and I want to get out as much cleave as I can, if I'm playing with like an enhancement shaman or I'm playing with a rep paladin, these are generally my melee cleave talents. I like to have disarm for the utility, Stormer of Destruction to get out more cleave, and it'll work with your legendary that we're going to talk about later, and then Sharpened Blade. However, if I am queuing into Rogue Mage, for example, I'm going to drop Sharpen altogether, and I'm going to go for team utility talents because I just need to live in those scenarios. I need to do my best to keep my team alive for as long as we can, to run through all of their cooldowns to eventually secure the win. And in those cases, I'll take things like Overwatch, Banner, and Disarm. So if I'm queuing into Rogue Mage 3s, Rogue Mage Druid, Rogue Mage Priest, Rogue Mage Pally, I like to have as much utility as I can, and I can't really, afford to take Sharpen because all of these have amazing use cases. War Banner in particular is one that's going to be a little bit tricky to use, and it's one that you're going to have to get used to using. So an ideal way to use War Banner for a beginner is to drop War Banner after your healer has been sheeped before the second sheep cast goes off. So he'll sheep your healer once, then you can drop the War Banner before the next cast is about to finish to then reduce the time your ally is in a sheep. When you get better, you can preemptively use it, but you want to start getting used to using it. Overwatch is a preemptive spell. You're going to have to intervene your ally, and when you intervene your ally, they get a reflect on them, and that reflect will then return the spell back to the enemy that casted it. So if you reflect your ally, the first spell that they receive from the enemy will be reflected back. So you have to time it very well. You can't do it too early. You have to do it towards the end of the cast, and you can reflect sheeps that way, cyclones, any spell that's casted or targeted on that ally will go back to the original caster. So it's very effective at avoiding CC and things like that. You want to use it to stop CC chains or prevent them. Disarm is going to be good for the rogue, so you can disarm before the go, you can disarm during the go. So if they are spamming cheap shots on your ally and you don't have intervene and you need to prevent that go, or you want to prevent some of the damage, you can use disarm there. So these 3 in combination can make it very difficult for the enemy team to get going in those setup based comps. And that's why I like taking these there. I also take this exact build pretty much into jungle. I'll save disarm for the hunter. I'll use Overwatch for the traps, the freezing traps that are thrown by the enemy hunter. And then I'll have Banner as well for the traps and cyclones. If you don't know what jungle is a comp that's typically paired with a Discipline Priest, Feral Druid, and Marksman Hunter or Survival in some cases. And it has great use case there. So setup-based comps, these are generally my go-to. If I have nothing to disarm and there's nothing in that setup-based comp to disarm, you might take Sharpen, or you could take Master and Commander for a shorter cooldown and a larger rally to give your team a little bit more defensive utility. So that's typically what you'd play. Those are the talents that you'll mess around with. You just kind of have to get comfortable into knowing what you're fighting. So if you're a big beginner, just take Sharpen every game, maybe take Short Bladestorm every game, and then maybe take Big Rally every game. These are talents that you can generally take as a beginner, and then as you start getting more comfortable queuing arena, you can start messing around and experimenting with other things. Again, melee cleaves generally look like this. Setup-based comps generally look like this. And then if you are having a comp where you can't disarm, you can kind of move something out. Also, duel is another one that is pretty underrated. You can duel an enemy, and if they're not attacking you, they're dealing 50% less damage. So you can duel to reduce some of the damage your healer is taking or your ally. And these are all great supportive talents here. So that is probably the skill cap to the warrior class, is these talents and knowing when to take them. I think the best way to start out is to just kind of go through each cookie cutter one and see what works best for you and the comp that you're playing. And if you do have any questions, you can leave your comments in the comment section below. But I hope that does a good way of explaining it. And again, you can check out Magnus's written guide as well to kind of get some more information on these PvP talents. Okay, now hopping into your covenant choice. Now there's two main covenants that you can go. Some would say three. For me, I believe Kyrian is the best covenant choice because of the Pelagos tree and Spear of Bastion, and the fact that you also get this Phial of Serenity, which is going to give you a little bit of healing. It's going to cleanse disease, poison, and curse effects. And paired with all three of those together, it's just a good combination overall. However, if you are someone that raids a lot, now I want you to keep in mind that I also raid as Kyrian. I'm in a Mythic Raiding Guild, and because of the recent Mortal Strike buff in PvE, I'm able to do a lot of damage actually in PvE because Mortal Strike's been buffed, and most Venthyr warriors, which would be the other choice that some people consider, the Condemn warrior. I get this question so much. Stoopzz, what do you think about Condemn warrior? Did I make a mistake? Because they're spamming Condemn so much, they're not pressing Mortal Strike as much, and because Mortal Strike's been buffed, I'm actually able to keep up a lot better than most people would think. So I raid as Kyrian, and I prefer Kyrian because of the utility of Spear of Bastion. It keeps enemies in place. I can peel my team with this ability, and it also works very well with your Bladestorm legendary, which we'll get into. However, for whatever reason, you really just don't want to play Kyrian, you can play Condemn Warrior. The only downside to playing Condemn Warrior is that, yes, you do an insane amount of damage with Condemn, but you're kind of one-tricked into spamming Condemn, and you're dumping a lot of rage because you can use it so often with Massacre, Sudden Death, and the fact that Condemn works above on enemies above 80%. In those cases, you're just dumping all of your rage, and you're not getting enough rage to use Ignore Pain as often and have rage for some of the utility spells that you need to have them for, right? So in general, I would say that it kind of takes away from the warrior's toolkit. It becomes a damage bot. That's not a bad thing. It's just right now what makes warriors so good is all of the utility that they do have, and not being able to spam Ignore Pain as much might cost you in the long run. It also feels a little bit clunky because you're not able to keep MS as much, and you're feeling like you're rage starved more often from my experience. And then also get a secondary covenant ability, which is Door of Shadows, and that isn't as effective as the Kyrian Phial. So just keep that in mind. The other option that you could consider is Night Fae, but overall I think it's either Condemn in my opinion because I'm seeing how much damage it's dealing, and it's also better in PvE, or Kyrian. I recommend Kyrian, but it ultimately is up to you. Now, since we're on the Covenant page, the conduits that I recommend currently are going to be the Stalwart Guardian as your endurance conduit. You're then going to either take Crash the Ramparts as your first potency conduit, or you can opt to take Mortal Combo depending on the one that you have. When I get my second potency conduit unlocked, I'll have Mortal Combo and Crash the Ramparts. I don't go for Piercing Verdict because it's more important to get a buff on your consistent damage. Warrior's all about consistent damage, and sometimes it happens you'll miss your spear. You'll have to use your spear when you don't want to, and getting increased damage on that isn't as effective as buffing your Mortal Strike, which is your hardest damage dealing ability, and then your second highest damage dealing ability is going to be Overpower. So buffing those is more important. And then your endurance conduits are going to be, again, the reduced cooldown on Die by the Sword, and the other one that I found to be pretty effective is Brutal Vitality, because your Ignore Pain is going to be obviously a huge part of your rotation, and buffing that is incredibly good. You could also opt to take Safeguard as your second finesse conduit. So that's going to be your left path essentially. You'll go down this way, here, and then it doesn't matter which way you go here. Potency, endurance. Now you're going to have a finesse row, which has a lot more utility. I rarely take this, but if some games you feel like you need it, the finesse conduit that you're going to want to have is Inspiring Presence, and then you'll go down here, get one of your potency conduits, whether it be your Crash the Ramparts or Mortal Combo, whatever one you have at a higher level. And then if you go down here, the other one I would take would probably be Safeguard, because Safeguard just reduces the damage when you're using Intervene, and that makes it pretty strong. So you'll have two rows here. one for more supportive utility and one that's more damage focused. But the endurance conduits for warriors, specifically Stalwart Guardian, are so strong, and it makes dive out of the sword a much smaller cooldown, especially as going into Shadowlands, they even reduce the cooldown on it by a whole minute. So overall, I think the left side is much stronger, but there are some use cases if you're fighting a team and you're struggling defensively to go for the right side using those finesse conduits. Okay, now going into your legendaries. The first legendary that you're going to want to make, I know for raid, a lot of players are taking Signet of the Tormented Kings. Signet of the Tormented Kings is a good raid legendary, and it is something that you will probably be taking if you are playing a Venthyr warrior. But if you are a Curian warrior and you are raiding, you actually can get away with the PvP legendary, the first one that you're going to want to make, and that is Unhinged. Again, Mortal Strike was recently buffed, so you'll get value out of it, obviously, for PvP. This is the first PvP legendary that you'll want to make. But in raid, it actually sims higher for me than Tormented Kings because it's all about getting those Mortal Strikes out. So this legendary is extremely strong. It's a pub stomper. It does a ton of damage, and it allows you to do really well into other melee cleaves, and it works very, very well with your Spear of Bastion. So what you'll want to do is you'll get your avatar up. Maybe you get some overpowers beforehand, and you'll want to have sweeping strikes up. You'll want to Warbreaker, drop your spear, and then you'll Blade Storm. And what this will effectively do is it will get out a total of 4 Mortal Strikes. You'll get 2 Mortal Strikes out, but because you have sweeping strikes up, it will then cleave onto the other target. So you're hitting this guy 2 times for 2 Mortal Strikes and this guy 2 times for 2 Mortal Strikes. Another important thing to keep in mind is that it does work with your modifiers. So with Overpower, you're buffing your Blade Storm Mortal Strikes. It does absorb those or use those. And it also works with Sharpened Blade as well. So your Sharpened Blade will hit both allies, or both enemies, I should say, and you will also use your Overpower stack. So it's very effective when paired with your spear, as they'll not be able to get out of it, and you'll get a ton of damage, especially into those melee cleave teams, or if you can get a healer and an enemy DPS in it. It's great for 2s. It's my favorite legendary, and it's, in my opinion, by far the best legendary. The second legendary that you'll want to make as a smaller side legendary is going to be Misshapen Mirror. Misshapen Mirror is very good into Rogue Mage. It's very good in 2s versus like Mage comps as well, because all you have to do is activate your Spell Reflect, and when you have this legendary equipped, I have it on my neck, and I have Unhinged on my gloves. Just how it worked out for me with my current gear. If I go to use my legendary, the nearest ally will get a Spell Reflect to reflect the next spell on them. So it lasts 60% longer. Doesn't really matter too much because all they have to do is ping it off one time. Spell Reflect works differently in Shadowlands. It doesn't just reflect all spells for a certain amount of time. It's the first spell. So you can use it to reflect clones, sheeps, and more importantly, let's say you are playing into a Rogue Mage, for example, and you and your Rep Paladin, if you're playing that comp, or you and your Enhancement Shaman are on a target, and then the enemy Mage is trying to spam sheep you guys to peel, you can activate your Reflect at the last second, and both you and your melee ally will have Spell Reflect to reflect that sheep back onto him to make it so he can't peel you as easily. So this has great use case in some comps, but overall, most of the time, you'll be playing Unhinged in setup comps where you can reflect and get value. I'll take Misshapen Mirror. And then the other legendary that you can opt to make if you have neither of these for whatever reason is Sephuz. This is an all-around very good legendary for almost every class in the game. It also comes off the PvP vendor as well for Honor. You really can't go wrong with Sephuz at all. Overall, it's a very, very solid legendary, but I do recommend you get Unhinged at some point, and I believe Misshapen Mirror is just a quest. After you get your first weekly vault, you'll have a quest next to the vault just to get this legendary instantly. So these three are pretty easy to get, these two especially, and this one you can kind of work your way towards getting, but I got it like after a couple dungeon runs. If you're able to do a Mythic Plus, it's even easier. And again, I even use this for raid, so all around it has very good value if you are a Curian warrior, and I highly recommend it. The rest of these, I think they're all pretty bad. So that's just my opinion on it. These three are the best. The rest of them, I just don't see them being that effective. Okay, now as far as desired stats go for PvP, you want haste and versatility. Versatility, if you had to choose one or the other, is going to be the more desired stat. However, haste just feels better because you're getting more rage, and we'll talk about that when we get into the tips and tricks portion of the video. So haste, versa are your desired stats. If you have pieces of gear that don't have haste first on it, but they're higher item level, it just depends how high it is. So if you have like a 184 piece with haste versa on it versus a 213, for example, I would just go for the 213. But if they're close in item level, like for example, I have a haste versa sword, but then I have a 207 haste mastery sword, I'm going to opt for the verse because the verse, number one, is going to make you deal more damage. It's going to make you a bit more tanky, but more importantly, it's amplified by your double trinket PvP set bonus. So it's a multiplicative benefit by 40%, meaning that I have right now 8% more damage in arena, and that's going to make up for the item level, and it's a way to work around having lower item level PvP gear, for example. So someone has PvE gear and it's higher item level than you, but they have no verse and you have this, essentially you're making up for that difference with this PvP set bonus. So that's something to keep in mind. I put versatility over haste, but you want to have at least an equal amount. And then when do you stop stacking haste and going for more verse? 20% haste is kind of that sweet spot. And then after that, you just want to dump into verse. Later on in the expansion, if you get to high amounts of versatility, you could start putting into mastery. So it's verse, number one, haste, and then if you have a lot of each, for example, mastery is also not a bad stat because it just gives you more damage and it's essentially like an offensive benefit for versatility, just in another stat form. Okay, now hopping into the tips and tricks portion of the video, we're going to talk about macros and some other stuff. I'll have a link to Magnus's macros down in the description box below so you can check it out yourself and you can kind of just copy them and paste them into your macro section. The ones that you're going to want to have is either Focus Stormbolt or Stormbolt 1, 2, 3. I always use 1, 2, 3 macros. It's just how I play the game. There's nothing wrong with using Focus macros or Stormbolt 1, 2, 3. It's just depending on your personal preference, and I'll have a macro video explaining how macros work in PvP also listed below. It's an older video, but it should teach you the fundamentals of why they're important. So I have 1, 2, 3 macros for Stormbolt to Stormbolt the enemy 1, 2, and 3 in the arena, or if you're just doing 2s, 1 and 2. But you can do focus ones. I also have intervene macros for my teammates as well because it's a lot easier than making it so I have to click on them and then intervene. But I also have intervene and charge in the same macro. So if you go here, this macro right here, it's a help harm macro for charge and intervene, meaning that it's the same key to charge or intervene. So even though I have 1 and 2 for my teammates, if there's like a totem or I'm in world PvP or I'm in a battleground or whatever it is, and I don't have party 1 and 2 for like raids or dungeons or world PvP, if I target an enemy, it'll charge them. But if I target an ally and press the same key, it will also intervene them. So it just frees up some key binding space, and I really do like that one. And then you'll also want to have kick 1, 2, 3 or focus kick, focus charge. I'll have a list of all of the macros. Magnus's documents, excellent. You can use those to kind of get some useful tips there. Another really great one to have is a stop casting Bladestorm macro. So if I'm Bladestorm, I can cancel it right away, and you can bake that into some of your other abilities like Charge or Warbreaker or Heroic Leap. Again, all those are listed below, so be sure to check those out. Okay, so after you got all your macros set up, let's just talk about some basic tips. So again, your talents are generally going to look something like this, for example, and these are your cookie cutter talents. Let's say you're doing 2s or whatever. As far as playing the warrior goes, there are some just key fundamental things. Number one, you want to make sure that you are always checking your D stance. So a lot of players get caught out of D stance, or they spend too much time into D stance, or they don't go into D stance. So D stance is what makes the Arms Warrior very good. If you're not doing anything and you're traveling somewhere, you're trying to get somewhere, you're moving across the map, there's no reason to be in battle stance. You're just taking unnecessary damage. If you're ready to press your cooldowns and you have setup going and it's ready to do damage, then obviously get out of D stance and pop your CDs. If you are not being targeted at all and you want to draw some attention to yourself to peel them off your healer or your ally, then make sure you come out of D stance, because they'll notice that you're out of D stance if they're any good, and they'll try to force you back into it by targeting you. So that's something to keep in mind. But know that if you're not doing anything, there's no reason to be into battle. If you have no cooldowns available and you're just spamming slam, which we'll kind of get into in a second, or whatever it is, there's really no reason to be into battle. Battle and D stance dictate the pace of the fight. So when I'm in battle, I need to be cautious that they could swap to me at any point, but sometimes I want them to target me. And if I'm not doing any damage and I am the focus, there's no reason to be in the battle because I'm just taking unnecessary damage and I'm probably focusing on living rather than trying to go for the kill. So just keep that in mind on your bursts. Obviously come out and go into battle if you can. If you're just sitting on something and you're trying to dampen them and be disruptive and tanky, make sure you are in battle. Another really important tip when playing the warrior is that you need to be getting auto attacks off to generate rage. That's how the class works. That's why having haste is important. And in order to get those autos off, you need to be on your target. And one of the mistakes that I was making along the way, and I'm still trying to improve on in general, is keeping hamstring up. You need to make sure the first global that you press when you connect to something is hamstring. And then you want to make sure you keep up your deep wounds and obviously in PvP, Mortal Strike. Deep wounds is going to increase the damage you deal to that target. Mortal Strike is going to reduce the amount of healing that they take or receive. And hamstring is going to allow you to stay on the target and slow them so that they can't move away from you, so you can get those autos off, so you can dump your rage into things like Mortal Strike, Ignore Pain, and then obviously execute when you get there. So that's just something to keep in mind. Make sure hamstring is something that you keep up at all times. If someone's running past you, make sure you hamstring them. Very crucial to keep the target slowed. Make sure Mortal Strike is on CD, so you're keeping up your debuff like Deep Wounds and Mortal Wounds, and make sure they're slowed. Do not let this fall off. It's a big mistake. Now, another common thing that warriors ask me all the time is, when do I press slam? Okay, again, this was something that I was learning along the way, and I actually learned about this doing PvP and PvE. Okay, slam sucks. Even though it got buffed recently, it's not the ability that you want to press. It's not something you like to press in PvE, and it's not something you like to press in PvP. It's just a very bad ability. It spends all of your rage dealing very, very subpar damage. Now, don't get me wrong. If you have nothing to press, you can press slam, but you have to keep in mind your priorities. So priority number one is to make sure that you Mortal Strike before you ever worry about pressing slam. If Mortal Strike's about to come up and I'm really low on rage here, right? And Mortal Strike's about to come up and I've dumped all of my rage into slam, this is not good. I don't want to be sitting here waiting to put up MS, right? So make sure if MS is coming back up, don't press slam if you're not going to be able to get off that Mortal Strike. You also want to be able to prioritize always at least putting up Ignore Pain, right? This is going to reduce the amount of damage you take. Ignore Pain is a partial absorb. It's not damage reduction. Essentially, you get a shield over yourself, and 50% of the damage you take goes into that shield. The other 50% you take up to a certain amount. So it's way better to keep Ignore Pain up than to use slam. Now, if you have Ignore Pain up or you're not being targeted at all, right? They're just training your healer and you have nothing else to press, then you can then prioritize slam. But there's so many other abilities that you'll often want to press. And if you look at the end of the game, even if you're dumping all of your damage into slam, it's really low on your overall damage. So slam is something you don't want to press. It's just a weird filler spell that sometimes you will press, but there's games where you could get away with not pressing slam and it's really not going to affect your overall DPS. It's not like BFA where you had an Azurite trait that really buffed your damage with slam. It's kind of a spell that you just don't like pressing, and there's better use cases. Now, outside of Mortal Strike being your highest damage dealing ability and slam sucking, execute is always going to be the ability that if it's up, you want to press it. Execute does the most damage out of all of your abilities. You want to make sure you have Mortal Strike up on the target always, because you want that Deep Wounds and Mortal Strike effect, and then execute's priority number one. Now, moving on to Overpower. Again, you want to make sure you keep your MS up. You want to make sure that you're executing if you can. If you get a sudden death proc or if you have massacre range. Overpower does a lot of damage, especially with the conduit and especially with Dreadnought, this talent that we took earlier. So Overpower is a great ability because it buffs your Mortal Strike, increases the damage of your next MS by 20%, stacking up to 2 times. It also costs no rage and it can't be dodged or parried. So it's great in the rogues. If someone pops evasion or parry, you can still use that ability, So what you want to keep in mind is, as long as you have MS up, you want to then use Overpower outside of Execute. So if you don't have an Execute proc, then you want to opt to use Overpower. The only thing that you want to keep in mind is is if you are low on rage and you already have the MS effect up and deep wounds, you have both of these, then you want to use your overpower charges to allow yourself, this is a PvE thing that I learned, as long as you have those buffs up, you want to make sure that you are using overpower if you're low on rage to allow yourself to get more rage back so that you can then dump rage into executes if necessary or ignore pains. So don't rage cap yourself, meaning that if you have 100 rage and you have overpower and mortal strike up, press mortal strike. But if you're low on rage and you have MS up, but you're at like 20 or 30 rage or 40 rage, it's better to use overpower first to buff that MS. Doesn't cost any rage to press that, and it allows you to get more auto attacks off so that you have a larger rage bar. So rage capping is bad. MS is priority number 1. Keep the buff up, then execute. But if you are low on rage, sometimes it's wiser to be smart about what you're spending and opt to use spells that don't cost any rage so that you can have rage for when you need it. So hopefully that's understandable. It's not that important. You'll kind of learn this along the way. But if you have to go back and kind of watch that section again, don't overthink it too much. It's just something to keep in mind. And I learned how to min-max my damage by doing that. You have 2 big burst cooldowns. You have Avatar and Warbreaker. A lot of people assume that Avatar is more important than Warbreaker, but if you read Warbreaker, it does increases your damage on those targets by 30%. Avatar increases your damage by 20%. So Warbreaker is actually more important of a DPS cooldown than Avatar. Avatar's a longer CD because it gets you out of roots and things like that. So when you Warbreaker, it's very important to make sure you get use out of it. Don't just toss it out if you're rage starved. Don't just toss it out if you don't think you can get a lot of damage off. Warbreaker is far more valuable in terms of dealing damage than Avatar is. Avatar paired with Warbreaker obviously is a ton of damage. So that's something to keep in mind. So these are your burst cooldowns. You want to make sure when you activate both of these, you can get out as much damage as possible. And it's nice if you're playing Unhinged to pair it with your Spear and your Bladestorm Sharpen up sweeping strikes. As far as Sharpen goes, Sharpen is going to make it so that target takes 50% reduced healing with your MS effect. So you don't want to use this on CD if you don't feel like you're going to get value out of it. Sharpen is another way to kind of extend a CC chain or prevent healing on that target. So sharpening to deal damage is fine sometimes, but more importantly, Sharpen is used to, if the healer is getting out of CC, right when they get out of CC, the target you're on is right in front of you. You want to sharpen the target in front of you so that the healer has a harder time picking them back up out of that CC chain. Yes, it does buff your Mortal Strike damage, stacked with Overpower. It's pretty crazy, especially when you're using Unhinged, but you have to remember that Sharpen has a lot of utility to it. It prevents a lot of healing on that target, so you have to keep that in mind. It's not an ability you press for funsies. You want to kind of time it out well. The last thing we want to talk about is some of your utility spells. So you have Die by the Sword. It's a reduced cooldown, something you want to be using under moments when you're getting low or your healer's put into CC. It's a short cooldown now, especially with the conduit, so don't feel too bad if you waste it, but it's obviously good to time it well. You have to make sure that if you're facing a melee, you're not exposing your back to them because they can hit you through parry if they are behind you. So don't just be running away with parry up if they're right behind you. As far as your other defensive utility spells go, you have Intimidating Shout. This can be used offensively or defensively. So you have to keep in mind, if you're fighting Rogue Mage and your team has nothing left and you're not close to winning the game yet, do not just toss out your fear for fun. It's a long cooldown, and this can be used defensively to AoE fear everyone around you. So the way it works is if you're targeting an enemy and you press your fear, it's going to target fear that individual. You don't just press fear without targeting anyone. You have to target something and then you fear it, and it will fear that enemy, but everyone around you will also be feared. So sometimes you can land some gnarly triple fears, and that's something to keep in mind. It can be used to set up kills, so you can fear the enemy, and then maybe you get a stun on your kill target from somebody else, or you can Stormbolt them, and then you can try to close out more CC chains on the enemy that you feared. So the healer, for example. So you could fear the enemy healer, and then someone stuns the kill target, and then you can throw or lob your Stormbolt at them outside of the fear to extend that chain. So lots of ways to use fear there. Spell Reflect is baseline now. It has been changed. It does reduce the magic damage you take by 20%. but it only lasts 5 seconds or until the first spell is reflected. So if you're running behind a pillar and like an Aphlock or a Shadow Priest is rotting you down, it's not bad to use Spell Reflect to mitigate some of the damage you're taking, but there's probably a lot of better use cases for Spell Reflect. So you have to time it well now. You can't just press it, willy-nilly. You have to make sure you're getting it at the end of the cast to reflect the proper spell back. The final big utility spell that you do have outside of like Disarm and Ignore Pain, again, is going to be Intervene. Can be used offensively or defensively. So you can intervene to get to one of your allies, but you can also intervene to prevent some of the damage that they take from melee attacks. And there's a lot of use cases for it. So if you read Intervene here, it says run at a high speed toward an ally, intercepting all melee and ranged attacks. So you have to make sure that you are within 10 yards of them. And if you see here, if I intervene this Torn Cow right here, he has this buff, and all melee and range attacks will be redirected towards me instead. This includes physical kicks like rogue kicks or warrior interrupts, so you can intervene your caster friend to make it so that they can't be interrupted on crucial spells. This includes cheap shots, kidney shots, and it's very, very good at preventing an ally from dying on your arena team if they're caught into a cheap shot or a kidney shot. You just have to know that you're going to be taking that damage instead. So sometimes you want to make sure you have Ignore Pain up when you do opt to intervene some crazy burst. You want to make sure you're in D stance. If it's a lot of damage you're trying to intervene, you can use it with Overwatch again to reflect spells. But you also can intervene just to get ahead. So like if I'm really far away and I have no charges and my teammate wants me to get there to do something, I can then intervene to my ally as a second charge. But opt to use charge and leap before intervene, because intervene has a lot more utility. Intervene can also intervene things like shattering throw. So if you're playing with a Ret Paladin and you're fighting an enemy warrior and your Paladin bubbles, you can intervene him so he can't shatter the bubble. There's lots of ways to use intervene. It's one of the strongest abilities on warrior right now. And it's an ability that people are complaining about because it's way too strong. Just take some practice so you can use it defensively, offensively, and if you time it well, you can intervene almost every go, making your ally essentially immune to damage. The one thing you have to remember though is that if cleave is going off, you're going to be taking a ton of damage because you're intervening the damage on them and then you're also taking the damage. So if there's a Night Fate Hunter and he drops that giant circle down on the ground, that purple circle, not the Kyrian one, he does cleave damage to everyone in that circle. And if you intervene somebody in that circle, you're going to be taking the intervene damage and damage yourself. So you can get really blasted in that go. So be careful of that. Now, one of your last great utility spells is Rallying Cry. Just make sure you're in range. It basically gives everyone a Battle Master effect. It essentially gives them a temporary health pool increase. They get 20% extra health when you activate it. It can fall off, so be sure to keep mind of that. Eventually, it will fall off and their health will go back to kind of where it was if they're not healed up. So it's a great spell. Just make sure you're keeping track of when it's falling off. And then as far as some of your other cooldowns go, Sweeping Strikes, this is one of your strongest spells. It allows you to get essentially double the damage if teammates are stacked. So look for opportunities to do that. It's always great to get people to stack on you as a warrior. So if you can dictate the fight to maybe go to the enemy caster or healer, and then the melee will follow you as well. You can cleave off both of them. Trying to get sharpened blades on those goes is very good, or at least getting double mortal wounds. And if you are playing Rend, the only time you want to use Rend, or at least capitalize on it, is getting double Rends out. You just get double attacks out, and it's great with Overpower and Dreadnought. So Sweeping Strikes is big cleave, and then you also have Blade Storm. Again, with your Legendary, you want to use it more for burst. If you're not playing Unhinged, you can use Blade Storm to get out your mortal wounds on everyone, or at least your Mortal Strike effects, especially if you're playing Storm of Destruction. But you can also use it to break snares like roots and things like that, and then you can cancel it to continue to charge to the enemy and stuff like that. So those are pretty much all of the main abilities. Again, you have some extra utility spells that are pretty self-explanatory. Shattering Throw, you can use it to break bubbles, blocks, stuff like that. Big absorb Rapture Shields. You can also use Piercing Howl as an AoE slow. If there's a bunch of enemies running past you and you want to slow them and you don't have time to hamstring everyone to get all those globals out, you can use Piercing Howl. And then you also have your Spear. But generally, those are all the important abilities, things that you want to keep in mind. Final tip I have for you is don't overuse your mobility, okay? One of the biggest mistakes I made as a warrior was I was wasting all of my mobility charging around, and then I would get stuck in the middle of nowhere just hobbling to my target. So be smart about your mobility. If you don't have to waste a charge, don't do it. If you don't have to leap, don't do it. Obviously, if it's going to secure you the kill, then do it, but just be mindful of your mobility. You have a lot now with intervene, leap, and charge, but don't just waste them for funsies. Now, hopping into some of your arena comps in 2s, the warrior does very well with Holy Paladin, Resto Shaman. You can play with Resto, Druids, or Disc Priest. You can play all of them, but generally Holy Paladin right now seems like the best 2s healer for the warrior, but you can play with a Druid if you're trying to do that more dampener playstyle. For 3s, it's almost endless. You can play melee cleaves with DKs, Windwalkers, Rets are really good with warrior right now. You can play warrior mage, warrior shadow priest for 3s, warrior balance druid, warrior Ellie. You can play warrior enhance. Some of the strongest comps are going to be like warrior Ret right now, and then warrior shadow priest. But as the game slows down, the meta will change. Another really great cleave that I missed, I'm sorry, is turbo. So warrior enhance is also very, very good. You have a lot of comp flexibility when playing as a warrior. Now for RBGs, you always bring at least one warrior for battle shout and just the MS effect, so it's good there. And then in duels and things like that, the warrior really sucks. So you don't expect to do well in like open world PvP scenarios as the warrior. You really need a healer to excel. There's no double DPS warrior comps outside of playing with a prop pally, but people will probably spit on you every game if you decide to play with the prop pally. So that's pretty much it, you guys. I know it was a lot of information. If you have any questions, no slouching. If you have any questions, you can check me out on my live stream somewhere here on the screen. I stream Monday, Wednesday, Friday at 12 p.m. PST, and I also stream on Twitch in between those hours randomly. You can also check out my boy Magnus. I'll have his information somewhere here on the screen as well, and I'm sure he'd appreciate the follow. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one.